Start with you, and could you introduce John Jablonski for us?
I don't think I know all his credentials. I can tell you that John and I go way, way back. We met at a public hearing in Bemis about some zoning law changes that we were both very concerned about.
Two major watersheds, the Chautauqua Lake, Ohio River, Conewango drainage, which drains to the south and are the headwaters of the Ohio River and Mississippi River. Our waters from Chautauqua Lake, from Mayville down, drain to the Gulf of Mexico. Our waters north of the escarpment, about 4 miles up the road here to the north, drain north to Lake Erie and drain to the Niagara River, Niagara Falls, and Lake Ontario, and St. Lawrence to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the North Atlantic. So we're on a continental divide up the road just a few miles.
So in fact, there is a location up there as you're heading towards Westfield where if water drops on one side of the road, it heads in one direction and another way. What's that road? People, I remember John Ludsman would talk about that. Do you know?
I've always heard that it was a barn roof that did that. Take it down a little, even smaller scale, but North Portage or Route 394 north of Mayville is where that happens. So Chautauqua Creek really is directly west of here and runs to the north, and we have other creeks that are north of here that run to the south.
Now, it is quite remarkable. You'll see signage that you put up at various locations coming in towards the lake that are way out there. I mean, significant miles from the lake, which talks about you are entering the Chautauqua Watershed. So what's the total, just thinking of Chautauqua, for example, what's the total acreage that the watershed consists of?
I don't have the acreage. I believe it's 180 square miles.
Wow. So that's the impact water drops there that may find its way through streams, tributaries, etc. So, Becky, how did you, you're a biologist by background, what did you get into the hydraulics of this whole thing? It goes, because you got all of this comes together.
Well, everything, it all comes together. It's hydrology, it's ecology, it's biology, it's geology. I mean, this lake, if that's our focus for tonight as it is, it's an ancient lake. It's a glacial lake. It was formed, when the glaciers melted around 11,000 years ago. And so it's an old lake, and it's very productive. It harbors life. And of course, being a biologist, I'm a lover of life, and I love studying life. And I recognize how complicated and connected it is. There's so many interconnected aspects of this, web of life. So everything we do matters, and it has impacts. And so I'm fascinated not only by the lake and the waters and the life it supports, but I'm also very fascinated by the watershed forest, the wetlands, all of the rest of the aspect that, again, as I said, are all connected through water. Water weaves us all together.
So as you're talking about water, you also mentioned theology. How does that work? Because this is Chautauqua, and Maureen Ravenio is taking notes. She's the head of the Department of Religion.
Maureen said she would pray for us, and I appreciate that. Only because, yes, I'm a person of deep faith, and I also, everything I do, whether it's teaching at the college, whether it's writing letters of concern about herbicides in Chautauqua Lake, or encouraging others to steward our resources better, or being a very active participant in my creation care group at my church, Zion Covenant. To me, it's all connected. It's all part of honoring the Creator, honoring the creation, caring for it, being a good steward of the beauty and the gifts and the natural resources all around us. And I think sometimes we humans take so much for granted. And I believe in the precautionary principle as well. I believe that we need to look at the bigger picture, try to be as holistic as we can, and using science, because I very much am an advocate of using the scientific process and the evidence and the data and good process, using the science to make good decisions to better care for everything that's around us in this natural world.
So, John, you're just talking about the conservation, Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, and also part and parcel of that, it breaks down into various aspects of your organization. Certainly, I know about the acquisitions, you've raised money to buy land. Could you talk about a little bit about that process of how you identify lands that might be acquirable or worthy of being acquired, and how you actually do it, whether by deed, conservation easement, a little bit of, give us a little tutorial.
Okay, well, the land collects the water, and what you have growing on the land is very important. If water falling from the sky, which has pollutants in it, falls on pavement and goes directly into our lake, it pollutes the lake and fuels the plant and algae growth. If the rainfall lands on a forest, the trees and their roots and their leaves have a chance to absorb those nutrients and those pollutants and turn them into wood and leaves rather than having them run directly into the lake and feed the algae and the plants in the lake. So we have had a focus on conserving lands that are stream corridor lands. If you think of the lake as a body, and if you think of your hands as tributaries, we would like to put a glove on all the tributaries of forest land, of natural vegetation, between all the fingers and arms running to the body of the lake. Cover those all up with gloves and warm blankets so that the pollutants can't get that fall out of the sky or come off of parking lots or come off of septic tanks or farm fields, have to be filtered by the vegetation and used by the vegetation before they get to the waterway. So our land projects are designed to intercept the pollutants and turn them into good things that we appreciate, like trees, rather than having those pollutants get into the water and get to the lake where they fuel excessive plant and algae growth. So we focused, primarily our first focus was to try to save the largest undeveloped pieces of land on Chautauqua Lake. So the Cheney Farm was about 6/10 of a mile of land, very steep sloping land. That was our highest priority for probably the first 10 years that we were in business, and we were very pleased when it took more than 10 years. It took about 15 years, I think, to actually achieve that whole project. But that was a $3.6 million project. It started off by many meetings with family members, and John Cheney and I running around Chautauqua County talking to different people, trying to build support for the project. Convincing the county legislature to pass a resolution, I believe in 1992, calling for the conservation of all remaining shoreland on Chautauqua Lake. And we were very fortunate to have Assemblyman Bill Parment on the State Assembly, and he was very much a proponent of saving Chautauqua Lake. And so we worked with DEC, and the Conservancy got appraisals on those properties, and we convinced Bill Parment and others in DEC to partner with us on that. So they ended up buying the property in that case. In many cases, we raised the money directly through individual donations and through foundation contributions. We've had very strong support from the Gebby Foundation, the Sheldon Foundation, the Lene Foundation locally, the Went Foundation in Buffalo, and other foundations to support the conservation of these last remaining open spaces on the lake. So now, with very little left on the lake, we're moving up the hillsides and are working to conserve stream corridor properties, especially the wetlands in the watershed. We've managed to conserve 80 acres on the Chautauqua Lake outlet, which is identified in the state open space plan as being an ecological oasis. We own 3/4 of a mile of the shoreline from the north side of the outlet at Fluvanna down toward Jamestown, and that's just a very special area. Both in the outlet there, just wonderful vegetation that supports migratory birds all year round. If you go out there today, you'd see a lot of migratory birds that are there now. That's open. The rest of the lake is covered with ice, but that area is open and providing habitat for birds. And there are beaver dams and beaver ponds in those wetlands near Fluvanna Avenue that provide a lot of habitat, nesting habitat for a variety of waterfowl and beavers and mink and muskrats and all kinds of animals.
So you get actually acquire them outright, and some you actually work through conservation easements as well?
Yes, that is correct. We own a conservation easement on 12 acres of land at the Lake Chautauqua Lutheran Center, and that was purchased completely privately with private donations and grants. There was no state or public money involved in that acquisition, so the camp could continue to use that forest and that steeply sloping shoreline for their recreational and camp instructional purposes, but they could never develop it. So that's about, I think, 1,100 feet of lakeshore directly across from Chautauqua Institution.
Becky, you've got various programs at the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, and you have workshops, right? And you're out there, and you're pretty visible. Both of you are pretty visible. And often, depending on the topic du jour, you're there. And let's just go down a few of them that would, and to understand the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy's interest about, for example, the algae blooms and excessive plant growths. Kind of, where are you on all of that as far as programmatically?
Well, programmatically, we have the Don't Feed the Weeds program. We've got the Starve the Algae, Save the, is that the right one? You have to recognize that I am now, even though I've been on the board of the Watershed Conservancy for decades, I am now director emerita. So I'm not as up to snuff.
I don't believe this at all, Becky. This is.
But I am a very active member of our conservation committee, and I lead a lot of field trips for the Watershed Conservancy. But back to the algae question and the weeds and all of the rest. I think so many of the things that we have done, including conserving over 1,000 acres of forest and wetland and shoreland and all of these other areas in our own backyard, not just around Chautauqua Lake, but the larger Chautauqua area, all help to reduce that nutrient loading and that sedimentation, which is, it flows into any lake or water body, is going to promote algae and weed growth. So trying to encourage people to protect their land, to create those buffers through educational programs, through a number of the efforts that John has led over the many, many years, and our board. And by the way, we have a number of board members here, so I just want to say thank you to the board members for coming and everybody else. But we are concerned that if we don't do the preventive in terms of the nutrient loading from upstream, that there will be harder problems to fix downstream in terms of the weeds, the excessive weed growth, non-native weeds such as the milfoil, the Eurasian milfoil, and curly pondweed, but also the algae and the cyanobacteria, which have become a problem, in many lakes across our country, not just in our own backyard.
So is it safe to say that the principal focus is that which comes off of the land that finds its way through the watershed and into the lake? If we can somehow control that aspect of it, we'll go a long way towards what we see and we go in the lake and are fishing with John. Is that a fair statement?
That's a good statement. The thing is that people have to understand it's a long-term process, and that you don't get immediate fixes, but it's the much healthier manner to accomplish those kinds of things. Reducing the erosion, reducing the sedimentation and the siltation, letting the plants, the vegetation, the buffers, and the forests and the wetlands filter that water so it's cleaner and it's not going to have as many pollutants and other problem aspects as it's flowing downstream.
You've been at this since 1990?
90 was incorporation.
Yeah. Are there matrix? Are you able to kind of see that what started as an idea and you implemented programs like Don't Feed the Weeds and Starve
the Algae, Save the Lake.
Yeah. Where you can actually say it's working? I mean, yeah. So how do you, is there a matrix to the John? I want to flip it back to you. Are you able to,
John.
Yeah. And this, I assume, comes from funding sources, among other things you're saying. Is there efficacy in what you're doing?
Oh, well, it's very hard to measure the water quality from year to year in the lake because weather affects the nutrient loading to the lake. If you have a year that has heavy rainstorms, frequent heavy rainstorms, you'll have way more non-point source pollution being washed off the hillsides and farm fields and into the lake. So you have to look at long-term trends. At this point, we cannot say that we've accomplished reducing the amount of nutrients in the lake from what we've been able to accomplish. It's easier to measure things like when you upgrade the wastewater treatment plants, such as has recently been done at the Chautauqua Utility District and the Northern Chautauqua Lake Sewer District. When you engineer the plant, you estimate how much phosphorus is going to be removed, and lo and behold, they're actually removing 85% or more of the phosphorus coming from those plants. So if you know in that case that was approximately 20% of all the external loading of phosphorus going in the lake, and you took out 85% of that, hopefully in the next 4 or 5 years we'll start seeing that in sampling that's done. As far as measuring the water quality from what we do, if you have a 180 square mile watershed, I don't think we would be seeing a measurable difference from the work we've been doing. However, we know that the Conservancy has partnered with the Soil and Water Conservation District and Chautauqua County and the Chautauqua Lake and Watershed Management Alliance, and almost a mile of stream bank has been stabilized in the past 5 years through those programs that the Conservancy has been partnering on, and that will help to reduce the sediments going into the lake that provide the fertile rooting bed for the plants to grow. We know from protecting public water supplies around the country and around the world that you want to have at least 70% of your watershed in forest. Overall, the Chautauqua Lake watershed is somewhere in the range of 62 to 64% forest. Some of the more external upper areas may be over 70%. You get the urban areas such as Mayville and West Ellicott, Lakewood, you could have 20 or 15% forest. If you develop 10% of a watershed, you see a decline in water quality in the streams in a watershed. So if in the long term, if we want to conserve the quality of the water in the lake and not see it continually decline, we have to try to maintain as close to 70% of the whole watershed as forest, and that means we need a very aggressive watershed forest and wetland conservation effort, conserving as much of what's not developed as possible. Otherwise, we can put new sewage treatment plants in, we can sewer the lake, but if we develop another 10 or 20% of the watershed in the next 50 years, we'll see more declines in water quality and more algae blooms and worse weed problems.
This is a jump ball. Either of you can handle this one, because it's an issue which I don't even know if it's within your purview. But we've had more fun, every organization that's been before us, on a question of which I don't know the answer, and they can't come up with it, is a discussion of Chautauqua Lake levels. Just the determination of the lake levels. It's low now, and yet there's controversy as to who controls it, why. Is this part of things that you and the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy are concerned about, the timing of the lake level, and does it impact what you're doing?
Go for it.
We have not gotten involved in that. That protocol was set years ago with the Army Corps of Engineers and Board of Public Utilities. I think that was in the John Lunsman planning director years, probably in the 1970s. What we look at is if we have lots of impervious surfaces in the watershed, like rooftops and streets and roads and interstates, that water lands on those roads and interstates and goes into the lake quickly, and that means you have to open up the dam and let it out the other end quickly when you have a major rainstorm. What our goal is to collect and trap and store as much of that water that lands on the watershed as possible and get it to soak into the ground, so that when you get to August and September and you get low lake levels, that the water hasn't been sent out the dam in storms in June and July. Because if we can keep our water going into our groundwater, not only do all of you have water in your wells to drink, but we have water coming out of the groundwaters into our streams, keeping the base flow in those streams, providing trout habitat, which is great for fishermen and other organisms, but keeping the lake levels up in the summer, because the higher the lake level is in late summer, the farther those plants have to grow, and the higher those plants have to grow to reach the surface. So that's another aspect of land conservation, is capturing stormwater and getting it into the groundwater.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer. You handled it.
That's the answer. That's why he's our executive director. He's got all the answers.
Well, just for the sake of everybody, I have been trying to track this down. There is a document, 1980s, John Lunsman, which seemingly is the footprint for the determination of the level of the lakes throughout the years. And that's the answer. Whether you like it or not, that's what they use. Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, they certainly have goals. They have focuses, and maybe, I don't, John, why don't you, while I've got this focused on you, kind of outline maybe some of the priorities of the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, 1 through 3 or 4 that you have.
Well, in order to protect the water quality in the lake, we intend to conserve as much of the lake shoreline as possible and the stream corridors and wetlands as possible. Through that activity, we have projects underway right now where we are working with landowners to hopefully conserve land on Prendergast Creek, Goose Creek, Cheney Creek, would be 3 right off the top of my head. On Casadega Lake, we are under contract to purchase 77 acres between Lilydale and Camp Gross to create a nature park, and we have a $90,000 state grant that has been awarded to assist with that purchase, and we've raised $160,000 to date, including that state grant award, toward the purchase and the establishment of that nature park. Another objective is to convince us and all of our neighbors not to fertilize the lake. We sent out a brochure to over 5,000 people about a month ago, to everyone who we have an address for who lives around Chautauqua Lake, trying to convince them not to add lawn fertilizer to their yard 4 or 5 times over the course of the growing season, because nitrogen, although the state has banned banned fertilizers for lawn care that have more than, I don't remember the number is, 0.67 or 0.77 of 1% of phosphorus. Nitrogen is what most people are putting on their lawns, in many cases if they subscribe to a lawn service, several times a year. What studies are indicating is that cyanobacteria, or commonly called blue-green algae, which can become toxic, may not necessarily become toxic unless they have plenty of nitrogen to make it easy for them to defend themselves. When they have plenty of fuel, they say, I've got excess nutrients, I can win this arms race, no one's going to want to eat me if I can make myself poisonous. So if we can convince everyone not to fertilize their lawns, that's less food for the algae to grow, and that also means less chance of people being harmed by the cyanobacteria, or their pets being harmed by swimming in water that has cyanobacteria in it. Want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Becky, talk a little bit. Wow, yeah, nice. You tossed it over to her. She was looking at pictures of Steve, and I don't know if she was looking at her. So, but how do you convince fertilizer is a big issue, and farmers use fertilizers a lot, and so you knock on a farmer's door whose property is within the conservancy geography, though not necessarily near the lake. How do you convince them? What's your elevator pitch to a farmer's?
Well, I think, we respect our local farmers very much. We do have conservationists that will go and speak with the farmers. The hope is that we can help them understand that creating those buffers that John mentioned earlier between the stream banks and their farmers' fields, or between the stream banks and where their cattle are grazing, can make a huge difference in terms of allowing the farmers to do what they need to do, but also to protect everything downstream as far as what might get into that stream. So we do have several conservationists who have done this very, very well. They create good relationships with our farmers, And so I think that's part of it. A lot of it is just awareness raising and trying to have that relationship and working together to meet those goals. We're also working very closely with, as John mentioned, with the soil and water conservation folks, and they have also good relationships with our local farmers. So I think collaborating with them has been very effective in terms of these stream bank stabilization projects that have really, I think, been very impressive, and I believe that they will make a difference that hopefully will be quantifiable down the line.
You talk about stream banks, excuse me. Normally, because the waterway is DEC regulated as a waterway, your municipalities have to get involved. How do you get engaged? Does a municipality say, Goose Creek, we got a problem? Do they come to the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy and say help? Or does it go the opposite, where you say to the town of Bustye, you got a problem and we can help you?
I'm going to give that one to John. He knows the answer.
It's a combination of things. We work very closely, as Becky said, with the Soil and Water Conservation District and the Federal Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we kind of jointly, if we become aware of sites where we know there's erosion, try to work with the landowners. The county did several studies about 10 years ago where looking at Goose Creek and Dutch Hollow Creek, and upon having engineering studies done, our conservationist Dave Anderson went out and waited on people's doorsteps until he could find the landowners to speak with them and try to convince them that there would be potentially county or state money available to help them not lose their lawns or not lose their farm fields. And fortunately, our Soil and Water Conservation District staff and NRCS staff have wonderful relationships with many farmers in our watersheds, and so it's a combination of teamwork, and we all bring different funding opportunities and different skills to the table, and so it's worked well. It doesn't always work. We've had some big projects that didn't go forward, that just because the landowners at one point or another decide not to go forward, but we've had, in most cases, a farmer does not want to see his cornfield dropping away into a stream because he's losing productive land or losing his pasture land. That's not working for him either. So usually 80% of the time, they're happy to get help. But we do have opportunities of federal and state funding available that are there, so that hopefully, and we're starting a program just now where the state is offering money for farms that have gone through the agricultural environmental management program to buy conservation easements on lands around Chautauqua Lake or Chautauqua Creek, lands that supply water to public drinking water supplies, and actually pay them to take that land out of production and put it into a buffer and fence their cattle away from the stream. So that's a program that's new in 2019 that we were just learning about, and we're working closely with Soil and Water. We have a couple of potential projects already that we're lining up that we will be submitting for state funding.
What's your view on herbicides? How does it? That's one of the hot issues, and I've read your statement that within moderation and where there's a high density and there isn't a drift. Could you kind of help explain a little bit drift, density, some terms? Do you want a piece of that, Becky? You're looking. There we go. I've seen it. I see the look.
All right. Well, let me first say that we, along with a number of other lake interest organizations, did draft and have 10 signatories at least, and possibly more, what's called a conservation statement for Chautauqua Lake, and we do have copies, as well as a lot of other literature and information about our organization, so we hope you'll pick some of this up before you leave. But herbicides do have a place under selective controlled conditions. When you're talking about herbicides in the water, it's more difficult to control the impacts of those herbicides. And some herbicides, in my humble opinion, are more concerning than others. For example, 2,4-D. I am very unhappy that it's being used in Chautauqua Lake because it has a number of of issues associated with it and risks, including, according to various agencies like the International Agency for what is it? AIRC, can't think of the name, the whole aspect of that, but a European and international set of organizations have found concerns, and so has some of the other local organizations in our country, concerns with 2,4-D in terms of possible endocrine disruption, potential carcinogen effects. Now, 2,4-D is often found in weed and feed products, so on land it's been studied a lot more effectively perhaps. But as far as herbicide use, some are more selective than others. 2,4-D potentially can cause problems depending on the dosage and the concentrations, not only for the targeted invasive weeds which we're trying to eradicate or at least control in Chautauqua Lake, but also for other non-target native species. And that's also true for the aquathol K, which is endothol. Endothol can target native species that are very desirable, such as the pondweeds that are not the curly leaf pondweed. That's one of our invasive types, our non-native types. But there are many native pondweeds in Chautauqua Lake and in our local ponds and other areas. And so they're not selective. They're not targeting just the non-native milfoils and curly leaf pondweeds. So that's a problem. Other concern I have with herbicides is that if you knock down the macrophytes, those are the weeds, whether they're the natives or the non-natives, you knock them down with these herbicides, which are intended to kill, debilitate, and cause loss of that plant, whether they die completely or just die back. That leads to decaying decomposition of those plants in the water column, which in turn releases nutrients into the water column, which in turn can then lead to greater opportunities for algal growth, for cyanobacteria growth, because now there are more nutrients in the water column, there's less shading in the water column, there's less competition in the water column for those nutrients, and the algae, many of which are beneficial, but some of which are not, and the cyanobacteria, which potentially can become hazardous or harmful algal blooms, they're going to have a greater heyday. And there are concerns, and there are studies in Wisconsin lakes and other lakes that have shown that if you knock your macrophytes, those weeds, down too excessively, typically with herbicides, you can tilt that lake, tip it over into an algal-dominated lake, which is not what we want. We want a plant-dominated lake. This lake has been dominated by plants for many, many hundreds of years. And it's got a healthy ecosystem and naturalized. Even the non-natives are naturalized. They've been here anywhere from 50 to 80 years, and they are part of the natural system. And yes, they can become nuisance. At nuisance levels, they can become problematic. But the wide-scale, large application of herbicides is probably not the best way to go, in my opinion.
Again, using the conservation statement for Chautauqua Lake, local organizations remain committed to improving the health of Chautauqua Lake together. That's over there, and it's signed by several organizations. And again, just on the herbicide, it says herbicide use can be suitable when it fits within an invasive species management plan and when other methods of nuisance plant control are not workable. The term invasive species management plan, is that what you were talking about?
Well, we have an invasive species management plan in the MMS that was created a number of years ago, and I was on a technical advisory committee, as was John. That MMS recommends not to use 2,4-D. There are other herbicides that would be more suitable. So yes, that would be part of it for sure.
John, I've seen the reference when, just again on the herbicide, about the concern of drift. The drift, when you apply it, they map out an area, a grid, and they say, we're going to apply it here. They get a DC permit there. And your concern is drift. Could you explain that?
Yes, drift is wind-driven or water moving downhill. The water in the lake doesn't stay where it is that particular moment. most of the currents in the lake are wind driven. So if you've been out on the lake, you know that you try to anchor your boat and the wind blows you downwind. The water moves, the surface of the water moves with the wind direction. The water on the surface gets carried down to these opposing shoreline. The water on the bottom gets carried and upwelled on the upwind side. Depending on how strong the wind is and what direction it's from, dictates where that water is moving on any particular day in Chautauqua Lake. At the same time, you have water moving down the outlet. So you have to pay attention to when ideally, it'd be great if you could just, put a curtain up and hold the herbicides in a particular area so they couldn't go anywhere until they dissipated. Chautauqua Lake is a large lake with lots of wind current, and then current going downstream down the outlet, and that all plays a role as to how long the herbicide stays where it's placed and whether it's effective or not. You have to have contact time with the plants, and also whether there's down current damage to plants that are not targeted. So, is that?
Yeah, what you have, kind of like the opposite of my sailing ability. It could be blowing like heck, and I feel becalmed. I'm just dead in the water. I mean, that's the abilities. That's what you really want as a guy like me in herbicides.
Right.
Never moves. Just
Right.
No matter what happens, just is right there. As we get closer to kind of wrapping this up, I want to make sure that both of you have a chance to say something, a statement that may not have been brought up in the Q&A aspect of this, just because that's our goal, is to make sure that the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy say, I got something I want to say, and Greg, you haven't asked it yet. So, John, why don't you, while I've got the camera on you, what would you like to tell this crowd?
Well, I think staying on the herbicide issue, we're not opposed to. We're agreeable with using herbicides on a limited basis where appropriate, where they're not going to impact large areas where there is heavy public use of water body for lake access, and where thresholds are met, as you stated earlier. But we're very concerned about widespread use that would potentially affect the fisheries in the lake and the habitat for wildlife. This lake is one of the best muskellunge and bass lakes and walleye lakes in New York State. It's one of the most heavily fished lakes in New York State. That's an important part of our local economy. It's a statewide important bird area, and a lot of waterfowl are dependent upon eating the insects and other organisms that live on those plants. And if the plants aren't there for habitat, then the habitat isn't there for all the insects and other creatures that feed the whole fishery. So that's very important to be very careful in where herbicides are used, and the type of herbicide used as well. So that's, from an herbicide standpoint. From a land conservation standpoint, and watershed conservation standpoint, I can't emphasize how important it is to conserve the watershed for the long-term health of the lake, to make sure it's usable for future generations.
So Becky, what would you add to that?
Wow, he did a really good job. Just that we need to remember that our choices and our impacts go far beyond what we often know. And when it comes to how we care for our lake, how we try to keep the water healthy and make sure that all members of this community, which are not only the human members, but all of the non-human members as well, have a place to live and thrive and be healthy. We do need to think about the impacts to those smaller creatures, and the kinds of choices we make have long-term impacts. And we hope that we can take that longer view and do more of that preventive kind of work, which is harder sometimes. It doesn't give you the quick fix, but it's going to be a healthier approach in the long run. And we have to start thinking like the Native Americans often say, those 7 generations down the line, what are our impacts today going to cause or lead to down the line? And we want to make sure this lake and all of the lakes in our watershed are healthy for a long time to come. So our decisions matter, And we have to speak up sometimes when we feel that the decisions need to be better informed, let's say. So that's probably enough for me.
John, I'm going to give you the last word. There's been much, in fact, we had County Executive George Barillo here, and the County Executive is, as an active plan in his administration, is to be more engaged, more directly engaged. That's not a statement regarding his predecessors, but just to be more engaged with an eye towards a consensus strategy which would sort of try to bring the maybe disparate interest of some of the stakeholders more consistent. Do you think that's possibility? Do you welcome that initiative by the county executive?
Yes, I was glad to see Mr. Borello take that
Take your mic up.
initiative.
Thank you.
I was glad to see Mr. Borello initiate that effort, and we were pleased to have the opportunity to be involved as one of the stakeholder groups and present the information that we base our decisions on, the science we base our decisions on, to the consultants working for the county planning department in that effort, and we look forward to the result of that.
So I'm going to ask a question which you're going to say, Greg, where the heck did you come up with this thing? As you know, I'm a baseball fan. As you know, this is spring training, and your president is Linda Barber. Is Linda here?
She is not.
Linda's here. Now, you know that her background is as a lawyer, and she was an antitrust lawyer. And you probably don't know this, but this may change your attitude, because you probably collected baseball cards. And in the good old days, baseball cards were principally put out by Topps. Linda Barber, your president of the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, commenced a lawsuit against Topps to permit other baseball cards to be distributed, which impacted greatly the estate planning of my baseball card collection. So I want the world to know that your leader destroyed the vision of many people of my ages who are collecting solely Topps baseball cards. Now the world is loaded with everybody else. You probably didn't know that, John.
I didn't know that, and I collected football cards, not baseball cards.
I didn't collect any cards.
Ladies and gentlemen, Becky Nystrom, John Chablowski, thank you.